I'll be recapping a Korean drama called The Killing V0te. It starts with a hooded man stabbing someone to death. A police arrives and holds him at gunpoint, but the hooded man doesn't care and keeps stabbing. 8 years later, we see a woman dancing in front of a webcam in an illegal underground streaming. Detective Moo-chan, the same police in the opening scene, is also watching her and uses the woman's clues to find their location. Without waiting for reinforcements, he bursts in and takes down all the men. While looking for the business owner, Detective goes into another room and starts planting evidence. The dancing woman, who we now know as Hyun from the cybercrime department, catches him and records his doings. He notices her and takes her phone as the rest of the police arrive. Hyun confronts him about planting evidence, and he remarks that she has a reputation for whistleblowing too. Later, Detective interrogates the leader of the illegal streaming. He's not cooperative, so Detective turns off the camera and brutalizes himself, then tells the culprit that now assaulting a police will be added to his charges. The culprit realizes this policeman is crazy and complies. Elsewhere, a man accused of selling child corn, whom we'll call Corn Man, is being released early from prison. The citizens are protesting his release, and Detective arrives to escort him. While being escorted, Corn Man hurls insults at the protesters, so Detective intentionally drops him, and the protesters attack him. Inside the prison, 3 inmates discuss how Corn Man was able to get out of jail thanks to another inmate known as Professor. Hyun is fixing her sister's laptop that's been infected by a virus when she runs into a suspicious video hidden in the codes. The video has a masked man talking about the flawed state of Korea's judicial system. In Corn Man's hideout, he is releasing a new batch of corn videos immediately after being released, and he laughs about getting an early release by marrying a Russian wife while in jail. The next day, Hyun shows the video to her team leader, but he tells her the person must be an attention seeker and to ignore it. While Hyun's sister is sitting for an exam, her teacher pulls out his laptop and suspiciously texts someone called Executioner, asking if they should start. Immediately, the whole nation receives a notification on their phone. The notification is a poll asking the people to vote on whether to execute the just-released Corn Man or not. Most people don't take it seriously and undoubtedly vote yes. The police start looking for Corn Man, who is in a club surrounded by women. When he finds out about the poll, he also thinks it's a joke and orders all the women to vote yes. In the next scene, we see Corn Man tied to a chair as the masked vigilante ends his life. The next day, his body is found in his corn hideout. He died of suffocation from money being stacked down his throat. The masked vigilante releases another video and provides proof of killing Corn Man. Then he says that citizens over the age of 18 will have the chance to decide whether criminals who've evaded punishment live or die. It will happen for 1 hour on the 15th and 30th of every month, and if the yes votes exceed 50%, then the person will be killed. The police higher-ups discuss this since it's causing a stir in the nation. They note that they'll be criticized by the public whether they catch the masked vigilante or not, since a majority of the citizens think the masked vigilante is doing justice, but in law, he's still committing murder. Then one of them says he knows the perfect scapegoat for this task. They tell Detective to form a special team for the task. He figures out their plan, so negotiates that if he succeeds he should be allowed to join the headquarters investigation team. Meanwhile, Hyun's team leader asks her to pretend she never found that video on her sister's laptop, since it would imply his negligence. This pushes her to the edge, and she gives him a piece of her mind. Hyun's friend, Dan, is also included in this special team. Hyun disregards her team leader and shows Detective the video she found. She points out that a certain phrase the vigilante uses in that video is similar to something a defendant said in court 8 years ago, a case Detective was in charge of, so she thinks the defendant is the vigilante. This revelation makes Detective fall into another flashback. In the flashback, we see the defendant being talked about is the hooded man in the opening scene. He was taking revenge on the man who essayed and killed his young daughter. Cutting back to the present, the man is still in prison, and he's the professor the inmates were referring to. Detective isn't convinced Professor is the vigilante since he's still in prison and has never received any visitors. Hyun asks to be added to his team, but he refuses. In prison, we see that Professor is respected and is a positive influence for the rest of the prisoners, having helped one of them get a GED degree. However, he doesn't seem interested in discussing Corn Man's death. Meanwhile, Hyun learns that she has been accepted into the special team. Detective visits Professor, but he refuses to meet, and the prison guard privately offers to help him if he needs anything. Afterwards, Detective and Lieutenant Choi go to the club where Corn Man was last seen. After being beaten up, the waiter gives them the contacts of the taxi driver who picked up Corn Man. They talk to the taxi driver, who gives them the taxi's number plate. Unfortunately, the killer is smart and has already discarded the taxi in a junkyard, and the police are too slow to stop it from being crushed. Hyun and Dan find the IP address of where the virus on her sister's laptop originated from. They go to the address and realize it's Corn Man's hideout, and a short while later, the special team also arrives. Inside, they find a cable and Hyun copies all the data she needs from it to analyze it later. Detective decides to set up an interview for Hyun and the prisoners. Professor, getting special treatment from the warden, is excluded. However, he changes his mind when he learns that Hyun is asking everyone if they're familiar with the phrase she heard from the video. While being interrogated, Professor ignores Hyun's questions and tells her that maybe they should look for the next victims instead of the killer. The scene shifts to a woman taking her kids to school, but intentionally pushes them in front of an oncoming car. Fortunately, the car stops on time. However, she proceeds to take the kids to an alleyway and starts beating them when she's stopped by someone and is abducted. That same day is the Killing V0te day. The masked vigilante brings up the pictures of the just abducted woman, whom we'll call Fraud Woman. Masked vigilante explains that she killed her 3 ex-husbands with poison for insurance money and provides proof. As the people vote, Hyun and Dan locate where Fraud Woman is. They find her in a car rigged with a bomb on top of a building. Detective enters the car and realizes the bomb might go off when the voting ends, so asks his team if there's a wide-ranging area close by but far from civilians. Hyun suggests her sister's high school since it has a large sports field. Hyun also goes to the school, and after safely getting her sister to a taxi, she proceeds to the sports field. Detective and Fraud Woman are able to arrive at the field 2 minutes before the voting ends. Detective, realizing masked vigilante was listening to them the entire time, asks him what the citizens will think of him if he kills an innocent person. Then he says he won't get out of the car unless he stops the bomb. At the same time, Hyun is rushing towards the car, but it explodes beforehand. She is shocked and in tears as she watches on. Teacher watches the explosion from a distance and spots 2 students recording the whole thing. Worried about Hyun, her sister exits the taxi and sneaks into the school. While looking for Hyun, she sees teacher handing the 2 students some money in exchange for the video, and she records this exchange. As public support for masked vigilante increases, a journalist reports that an innocent police officer is critically injured because of the explosion, so asks the people to reconsider whether this masked vigilante is a hero or a criminal. At the hospital, the director of police is questioned by the press. He denounces masked vigilante and says detective is hovering in between life and death. At the explosion site, Lieutenant Choi notices teacher taking pictures of the scene and recognizes him, but teacher ignores him and walks away. Inside the hospital, we see detective is alright and only has some minor injuries. Turns out it was journalists' idea to lie to the public so that they'd change their opinion about masked vigilante being a hero. In a flashback, Hyun actually managed to pull detective away from the car before it exploded. After journalist and director of police leave, detective gets a call and is informed that, according to the autopsy, Fraud Woman was actually killed by poison and not explosion. Just then, Hyun sneaks into his room and confronts him about lying to the public. He retorts that a little lie is necessary to shift public opinion. Elsewhere, teacher sends the video he bought from the students to executioner. His mother, whom we'll call politician, arrives. She expresses her interest in masked vigilante and says she wants him on her side to win the presidential race. The next day in school, the computer of Hyun's sister isn't working, so one of her classmates, Kim, helps her. Because of this, she takes him back home to show him the video planted on her laptop, hoping he can help her decipher it. She is hoping to be a journalist someday, so she wants to catch masked vigilante too. Together, they figure out the background noise. However, Hyun catches them and goes ballistic on them for going through classified information. After a while, her anger subsides, and she joins them. She realizes that the video was recorded inside Professor's home, and her sister and Kim convince her to let them tag along. When they arrive, she tells the students to stay outside, then texts Detective her whereabouts, and afterwards jumps over the wall. Inside, she finds the words, "The 13th one was wrong," painted on the wall. At that moment, someone emerges behind her and knocks her out. When Detective receives the message, he creates a distraction and sneaks out. When he arrives at the house, he sees the culprit, and they get into a fight. The culprit manages to escape but bumps into Hyun's sister. She tightly hangs onto his leg, but Kim convinces her to let go, and the culprit slips away. The next morning, as the police are investigating the house, teacher secretly watches them from the next house. Detective and Hyun go to prison and question Professor about the message on the wall. Professor says it could be about how he killed his daughter's murderer. He stabbed the murderer the same number of times his daughter was stabbed and in the same manner. But the 13th one was wrong since the knife slipped in his hand. Hyun then asks him if there is someone who respected him, was close to his daughter, and could have access to such classified information. Professor says Detective is the only one who fits that description, and she doesn't know what to make of it. Meanwhile, journalist gets an anonymous text, and she urgently rushes out, telling her colleagues to grab their cameras. Elsewhere, at Korn Man's funeral, his Russian wife is killed by someone. Masked Vigilante then starts a live video nationwide, exposing the police's lie that Detective was seriously injured because of him, accompanying it with video proof, the same video the students recorded. The press turns up outside the prison just as Detective and Hyun exit, and his unscathed face is plastered on every news screen. Detective addresses the press and issues an apology, then reminds Masked Vigilante that he's a criminal and not a hero. Teacher is watching this news from bed, accompanied by a woman. When she distracts him, he beats her up, and once he's done, he throws an expensive watch down at her. At the special team, they're all furious about Detective's deceit since they were all concerned about him. Lieutenant Choi explains that he did that so as not to involve them in case it backfires. Hyun takes Detective to her house because he won't be safe elsewhere now that the public is angry with him. He gets off on the wrong foot with Hyun's sister, and while arguing about the culprit who attacked Hyun in Professor's house, Hyun's sister mentions that he smelled like fireworks. This makes them suspect Masked Vigilante because explosives also smell like fireworks. Later, Hyun and Detective share drinks, and he notices a scar behind her ears. She discloses that she got it from a car accident that killed her parents when she was 20. Then they decide to find the school kids who took the video of him escaping the car, and just then they receive a message about Russian wife's death. The autopsy reveals that she struggled a lot against the murderer. This leads Detective to think it's a different person from the culprit who attacked Hyun, because he was clearly stronger. At school the next day, teacher watches female students playing outside through the window, and Kim notices him. The woman who was in bed with teacher goes to a shop to sell the watch he left her with. Politician arrives and slaps the woman, whom we now know is an actress. Politician smashes her watch, then gives her a slightly cheaper one. When the actress scoffs at it and threatens to reveal everything about her son, Politician orders her guard to slash her face so that she never earns again using her pretty face. At school, a couple of students are bullying others and even using the Killing V0te method, but Hyun arrives and stands up to the bullies. One of the bullies is infuriated and goes to attack her, but Kim steps in and gets hit instead. Detective finally arrives at his special team's office and sincerely apologizes for lying to them too, and they forgive him. In the security footage of Korn Man's funeral, they notice the taxi driver was also present. Just then, Hyun gets a phone call about her sister and rushes to the hospital. At the hospital, Hyun's sister notices one of the doctors trying to take inappropriate photos of an unconscious patient. Hyun arrives and is updated about the situation, and she also meets Kim's grandmother, who's a doctor in the hospital. Grandmother seems fond of them, but when they leave, she tells Kim to stay away from Hyun and her sister because they're trouble. Hyun meets journalist and we find out she's the one who exposed Hyun as the whistleblower. Hyun confronts her about betraying the police, then asks her for Masked Vigilante's contact, but journalist denies having it. After Hyun leaves, journalist deletes the contact from her phone. Prison guard meets with detective and shows him the letters sent to professor over the past 5 years from someone called #1 fan. After analyzing the letters, they notice that the death methods of the first 2 victims were recorded in the letters, confirming that they were sent by Masked Vigilante. However, there seem to be some pages missing, so they go back to prison. In the security room, Warden informs Detective that Professor has been seeing a doctor for asthma. Meanwhile, Hyun is questioning Professor about the letters, and he admits to destroying some pages. He says he'll only disclose them if they let him out of prison. Then we see him implying that the next target will be from the military, and the episode ends with Professor exiting the prison. It starts with Hyun picking up Professor, who's accompanied by prison guard. Before his official release, he's transported to a temporary detention center where he can easily help the police. In his new cell, Dan informs Professor about all the cameras installed while also expressing his admiration for Professor. Then Professor tells Detective that he'll only communicate his leads with Hyun. Previously, Professor had speculated that the next victim of masked vigilante would be someone from the military with sexual offenses. Therefore, Hyun comes up with a very long list of possible offenders. The team meets with potential targets and gives them tracking watches that they can use to call for help. At the hospital, Dr. Oh, the same Dr. Hyun's sister saw recording his patient, goes to his office. He logs into a dark web and puts up all the inappropriate videos of his patients for sale. When he exits his office, someone with remote access formats his laptop. After school, Hyun's sister insists on accompanying Kim to the hospital for a checkup. When they arrive, Kim asks her to buy some sandwiches, then proceeds alone. Elsewhere, Politician is chatting with Teacher and she suspiciously tells him that if Detective poses a threat to him again, she will make sure to kill him. Before long, the third killing vote begins. The target is Captain O, whose essay of a woman led to her unaliving herself. In a turn of events, Masked Vigilante doesn't reveal the target's full name. However, Dan still narrows down their list to all men with the last name O. Just then, they get a call from someone claiming to be the target, and we see the caller parched in a dark room. Detective and his team depart to find him, then tells Hyun to leave with Professor and follow them. Professor is supposed to help them catch Masked Vigilante, since they speculated someone he knew. At the hospital, Dr. O also hears Masked Vigilante and starts panicking. He locks himself in his office, then calls the police and tells them he's Captain O. Detective is taken aback, so he puts both callers on speaker, trying to discern who the right one is. Meanwhile, Hyun continues researching and notices that the real Captain O was a military doctor, so she changes destinations to the hospital. Dr. O notices Kim and realizes he's heard everything. When Hyun arrives at Dr. O's location, Professor recognizes a delivery man who used to come to his house. The man is suspicious and bolts out, resulting in Hyun chasing after him. Prison guard is left to monitor Professor when he finds a bomb. The bomb goes off, causing a stampede, and in the chaos, Professor slips away. Teacher, seated in a car nearby and listening in on the police radio, hears about Professor and wonders why his professor is there. The people try exiting the hospital but find that all the gates are locked and the security can't open them. Detective arrives and thinking fast, gets into a car and rams into the gates. In an interesting turn of events, Professor saves Hyun from being fatally hit by the delivery man. Meanwhile, a man shows up outside Dr. O's office and asks him to open the door because he's part of the bomb squad. Before he does, Detective calls Dr. O and warns him against it. So the man outside sticks a gas pipe under the door. Dr. O leaves his office holding Kim at knife point, so the assailant puts his gun down because he doesn't want Kim to get hurt. However, when Dr. O steps towards the gun, Kim pushes him away. Tables turn in the ensuing scuffle, and the masked man is now about to kill Dr. O, but Detective arrives with a gun. Hyun and Professor also arrive. Professor activates the sprinklers on the ceiling, leading to Detective shooting the masked assailant, but he still manages to slice the blade across Dr. O's neck. Later, the team realizes that the assailant has no ID or fingerprints. He confesses to being Masked Vigilante, but Detective knows he couldn't pull it off alone. He notices a scar on the man's ear that matches the one he gave the man who attacked Hyun in Professor's house. The team figures out that this man, whom we'll call Fiancé, is the fiancé of the woman Dr. O assaulted in the military. The next day, Hyun takes Professor to his house in return for saving her life. They find his daughter's painting, and Professor says the other person in the painting was his daughter's best friend. Later, Detective finds out that his team is being disbanded, now that they seem to have caught Masked Vigilante. In the security footage, Lieutenant Choi notices Teacher in the hospital's parking lot. He's suspicious, so he shows it to Detective. Detective then meets up with Hyun and orders her to send Professor back to prison for the time being. That day, Hyun's sister meets up with Kim and finds out he's still traumatized about witnessing Dr. Oh's death. Hyun's sister consoles him that Dr. Oh was a bad person, then shares with him that her parents were killed by a drunk driver and that if someone would kill him for her, she'd let them do it. Before Professor leaves for prison, Detective tells him he's planning a trap for masked vigilante. Professor fires up that his first trap failed, causing them not to find the accomplice of his daughter's killer. Then Detective whispers something to Professor, which can't be heard by Hyun, who's been watching them the entire time. Meanwhile, at the news station, journalist is upset about her show on the Killing V0te being cancelled, so she tells her boss that they can make a new masked vigilante. Fiancé isn't being compliant, so Detective brings in his supposed father-in-law. Seeing his father-in-law cry makes him cave. Fiancé confesses that he had an accomplice with whom they only communicated through a dark web. The accomplice called himself Professor's #1 fan. He also told Fiancé that he destroyed the person Professor loved the most. Meanwhile, Hyun sneakily gets the case report of the death of Professor's daughter. She finds out that teacher was actually a witness in the case. Because of this, she snoops inside her sister's phone to get teacher's contacts. In the process, she also finds the video her sister recorded of teacher bribing the students. From a cybercafe, Hyun tries hacking into teacher's computer but he easily blocks her. In prison, Kim's grandmother turns out to be the doctor who is treating Professor. Hyun spies on teacher, but as she's about to follow him, she realizes one of her tires is flat. Suddenly, teacher shows up and offers her a ride. The police are investigating teacher now that he's a person of interest. They learn that he was a brilliant student who won several computer science competitions and majored in philosophy of law. Hyun is in teacher's car when he suddenly speeds up and takes a different road from where he was supposed to drop off Hyun. Hyun is shaken, and just then Lieutenant Choi calls teacher. He tells teacher to accompany Kim to the station the next day to give a statement. Hyun also takes this chance to announce her presence. Interestingly, teacher does drop off Hyun at the police station as promised, and he seems to enjoy seeing her panic. At home, teacher is watching with his mother when suddenly, she asks him why he's killing people again. In his flashback, we find out he's the one who killed Corn Man's wife. He laughs maniacally and admits it, then tells politician that he has a gift for her. He reveals that he's masked vigilante, delighting her. The next day, teacher and Kim go to the station as instructed. Professor also arrives and meets face-to-face with teacher. Clearly, there's a tense familiarity between them, and Detective and Hyun curiously watch them. We're thrown into the past, and we see a young teacher attending a debate between professor and politician. Teacher is clearly obsessed with professor and is unhappy with his daughter because she takes all his attention. They happen to be neighbors, and one day professor's dog goes missing, so he asks teacher about it, but he denies knowing anything. However, his parents find the dog buried in their backyard, and apparently this isn't the first dog he's killed. Teacher's father hits him in anger, but politician steps in and tells Woo, the son of the housekeeper and the driver, to take the blame. Woo, whom we'll call retard, is retarded, so he obediently takes the beating instead. Later, teacher goes to retard and apologizes. Retard says people who apologize are good, so he offers teacher a gift, which is rubbing his earlobe. Then teacher says they need to take revenge on the person who ratted them. The next day, professor's daughter is on her way home when someone calls her from behind. 4 days later, detective gets news of her death. As her body is being carried away, detective notices teacher among the onlookers, with a mocking smile on his face. Professor is the first suspect but is ultimately released following a lack of evidence. At professor's house, detective calls himself professor's #1 fan and promises to catch the murderer. Professor then tells detective about his daughter's favorite toy that is missing and that was originally made for her by the boy he was supposed to adopt. The boy has an identical one, which he gives to help with the investigation. While casing the area, detective sees some cyclists and asks one of them for the footage from the camera strapped to her forehead. In the footage, he sees retard walking with professor's daughter. Their investigation reveals that retard has been accused of a lot of sexual harassment cases before, and teacher was always somehow involved. Teacher then goes to give a witness statement, saying that he saw retard leaving the house with a pink backpack, and detective notices a wound on his hand. Convinced that teacher is the killer, detective beats retard until he confesses that teacher was an accomplice. But he has no proof, until he remembers the toy professor gave him. We then see the new evidence presented to a judge. Apparently, the evidence contains an unidentified person's DNA as well. However, the original toy is found by the other party, and detective's evidence is dismissed, therefore retard is proven innocent. We should also note that the whole defense was funded by teacher's parents. Later, professor comes across retard and apologizes for the trouble he went through. Reiterating his belief that those who apologize are good, retard wants to give him a gift. He lets professor hear a recording of his daughter before dying. Professor looks shaken to the core. And that's how he ends up killing retard. Later, detective watches professor being escorted to prison. Hyun is also there, protesting drunk drivers. Teacher is there too, mockingly smiling at them again. Then we hear that retard's parents unalived themselves. Finally, back in the present, it's like a reunion of 8 years ago. Kim gives his statement, and then the police ask teacher to stay. Detective arrives and questions him about killing professor's daughter. Instead of leaving the station, Kim starts snooping around, but Hyun catches him. Hyun drives him to school and asks him to help her get into the computer lab. Once there, he pieces together that she's looking for evidence against teacher, and Hyun is impressed at his intelligence. Kim helps Hyun recover deleted files on teacher's computer, and they find the video of the car explosion. Once teacher leaves, detective talks with professor. Professor doubts teacher is masked vigilante because, while he fits the description of the #1 fan, he doesn't share the same values as masked vigilante. It's also revealed that when detective whispered to professor, he was telling him that if he were masked vigilante he would have killed his daughter's murderer first. Then detective asks professor what happened to the boy he was going to adopt. The scene cuts to Kim telling Hyun that he's actually an orphan. After Hyun leaves, he busks under the rain and remembers how he first met professor's daughter on a rainy day. We realize he's the boy professor was supposed to adopt, and he also witnessed professor murdering retard. Just then, Hyun's sister shows up and holds an umbrella over him, just like professor's daughter did years ago. The scene shifts to the special team gathered in a new location, and they figure out from #1 fans' letters that the next target will be a death row inmate. Meanwhile, one of the special team members discreetly attaches a tracking device to teacher's car. Politician tries to convince journalist to do another segment on the Killing vote, and says she's already communicated with journalist's boss. Journalist isn't quick to accept and asks who the next target is, to which politician just smiles. At school, Hyun's sister is worried about Kim since he hasn't been to school for the past 2 days. She's approached by teacher who asks her if she knows where Kim lives because the address he provided is actually vacant. Elsewhere, people with vigilante masks are having a meeting. It becomes clear that masked vigilante isn't one person. They discuss their next target, which is indeed death row inmates. The plan is to exchange their vitamin tablets, which will react with the bottled water, thus giving them a heart attack. One of the masked vigilante is particularly nosy about the others' identities, and he turns out to be taxi driver, from the first Killing vote. Detective goes to teacher's house to arrest him, having found evidence linking him to the murder of Corn Man's wife. At the station, teacher comes face to face with professor. Professor asks if he's the #1 fan. Teacher just says he loved the replies he received from professor, but professor had never written back to him. Professor then asks him if he's masked vigilante, and teacher responds by laughing maniacally. The next Killing vote starts, and this time, the target is detective. Masked vigilante says detective is a crude police who plants false evidence on innocent people and unjustly beats them up too. Clearly, masked vigilante is twisting the reality of what happened, but the vote has started, and people will definitely vote yes. The team realizes there has been an electricity surge at teacher's house since the voting started, so they move to investigate. Elsewhere, Kim is busy working on his laptop. He calls his grandmother who's already in prison to administer the medication, and asks her to abort the mission because #5 has betrayed them. Turns out they are also masked vigilante. Because of the betrayal, Kim rushes to stop the voting. At the police station, Hyun is fed up with teacher's smugness and pulls out a gun on him. Politician also arrives with lawyers when the Killing vote disappears because Kim has managed to stop it. In the aftermath, detective dreams of his mother's death, but when he turns her over, he sees Hyun's face. The next day, he's given leave from work until everything settles down. At work, Hyun finds interesting clues left in her drawer. Similarly, detective delves into the case and remembers teacher saying he received replies, but it's been confirmed he never did. So he realizes the killing vote was actually professor's reply. Hyun confronts professor. She found out that after receiving the first letter from teacher, he momentarily lost his mind in anger. However, that first letter is missing. Just then she receives a call from detective, who tells her the real masked vigilante has been professor all along. The episode ends with a water truck crushing into the jail cell and professor escaping in it, now free to enact his plans. It starts with journalist resuming her Killing V0te show. She informs the audience that they're going to open a public forum where people can share stories of injustice, and the story with the highest likes will be considered by masked vigilante. At the station, fiancé holds a guard hostage, and he's shot in retaliation. This distraction allows Professor to escape, with Hyun and detective pursuing him, but he still manages to lose them. Professor has a flashback, which shows that the first letter from #1 fan was him admitting his murder of his daughter. Later, Kim's grandmother secretly handed him a phone while treating him. Professor texted Kim and told him they needed to expose the killer to the world, setting his plan into motion. At present, Kim and his grandmother head to Masked Vigilante's main server room and find it trashed by Masked Vigilante #5, who's the taxi driver from the first Killing V0te. They suspect taxi driver betrayed them to join forces with politician, and that's how they managed to implicate detective in the previous Killing V0te. Kim gets a message from Hyun's sister that she's waiting for him at the playground, and he leaves to meet her. Detective is searching Professor's house when Hyun also arrives, and he finally discloses to her about Professor's near adoption of an orphan boy. Kim meets Hyun's sister, and as they're talking, he sees a shadow and excuses himself from her, saying that his father has arrived for him. It's indeed Professor, and they embrace. Professor visits the server room with Kim and his grandmother. Kim's grandmother wonders if #3 will betray them like #5, but Professor assures them he won't. Elsewhere, teacher is marveling over the Killing V0te program he got courtesy of taxi driver. Taxi driver reminds teacher that he promised to get him his revenge and also reveals that the program was made by #1. Meanwhile, politician orders journalist to choose a fabricated story from the forum that she has been manipulating. This pisses off journalist, and afterwards she gets a call from detective. In prison, Hyun investigates Professor, and she finds out that his doctor was Kim's grandmother. Meanwhile, detective is also looking into the boy Professor was supposed to adopt but doesn't find conclusive information. As he wraps up, Hyun calls and tells him about Professor's and Kim's grandmother's connection. Simultaneously, journalist breaks the news about Professor's escape from police custody, which lands the investigation team in even more trouble than before. We then see Dan getting a text from Masked Vigilante #1. Detective visits Kim's grandmother to question her about Professor, and the hiding Professor listens on from upstairs. Detective notices movements upstairs and rushes over, but can't find anyone, therefore, he leaves, still filled with suspicion. As news about his escape spreads, Professor blends into the crowd and slips a note to an approaching man, whom we find out is actually a police officer. Following the message he received, Dan and Hyun believe they have a lead on the real Masked Vigilante #1, and have set up a meeting with him in a park. However, it turns out to be an ordinary student who delivers a note to them, which simply says, "See you when the weather is nice." Elsewhere, Professor assures Kim that Hyun will decipher his note and that they must reclaim the program from teacher. Trying to understand the note, Hyun finds out that there's 2 weather apps on their phones, and she exclaims that she has figured it just as detective arrives. Journalist is about to begin her Killing V0te show when the police arrive. Hyun informs the audience about the 2 apps and tells them the second app is how Masked Vigilante accesses their personal details and streams, so asks them to delete the app. Teacher is watching this on the news and gets enraged, but politician calms him and ensures him that it isn't over yet. Afterwards, Hyun confronts journalist about leaking Professor's escape to the public. Journalist retorts that Hyun should first find out who gave her that information. Hyun realizes it was detective and confronts him. He says it was the fastest way to find Professor. Hyun is disappointed and says she will leave his team. The next day, Dan realizes an electricity surge from politician's house, and shortly after, the Killing V0te starts. The fake masked vigilante admits that the public has lost faith in him. To make up to them, he picks the popular incident on the message board for that day's vote, the same one politician manipulated. The incident is about a real estate con artist who stole from a family, causing the family to unalive themselves. At the moment, the con artist is tied to a chair, and we see taxi driver is one of the people surrounding him. The man had sent him to prison, so this was the revenge he was talking about. Turns out not a lot of people deleted the app, therefore the final vote is beyond 50%, and the man is killed. The next day, Hyun and Dan infiltrate politician's house disguised as people from the internet company. Hyun sneaks into teacher's room but keeps in touch with Dan. At first, Hyun doesn't find anything suspicious, but shortly after, finds teacher's secret room and unlocks his mega computer. Engrossed in the investigation, she fails to notice when the secret room closes. She panics momentarily, but pulls herself together and continues searching. She finds an implicating video of professor's daughter crying for her father. Concurrently, teacher is on his way home. Hyun sends detective the video she found and informs him of her predicament. Therefore, detective gathers his team to rescue her. However, teacher arrives ahead of them. As he's about to enter, he gets a call from politician and he returns to his car. We then see that politician already has the video evidence Hyun found, and the police mole is none other than Detective Choi. As detective is leaving the police station, teacher arrives and turns himself in, confessing to his crimes. Teacher's computers start formatting themselves just as the police arrive to seize them, a bit too late. Detective and his team head to the murder site based on the video Hyun uncovered and find it neatly painted and the floors changed. Detective figures that politician knew about her son's actions all along. He also surmises that teacher's timing to surrender was too much of a coincidence, unless politician had intel that they had found the video. Detective Choi chimes that it must be a criminal's instinct, but detective looks at him suspiciously. Hyun believes teacher would have backed up his data on cloud storage, therefore she looks for his laptop and finds it in school. The team has so far figured out that taxi driver stole the program and joined politician. Detective suggests they look closer at Kim's grandmother, since masked vigilante seemed to have help from a medical expert. Dan also points out an unknown person X, a tech-savvy person who must have created and spread the killing vote. Afterwards, Hyun informs detective that they couldn't find anything on teacher's laptop. Journalist is having a drink at a bar when professor enters. She tries to escape, but finds the door locked. Professor then confesses that he is masked vigilante, and offers her a proposition. On her next show, journalist features masked vigilante as her guest. He apologizes for installing the app without their consent but promises them that their data isn't being stolen. Then he requests that the people update the app to continue fighting for justice. Afterwards, he describes the next target, who's clearly teacher, even though he doesn't reveal his name. The police arrive only to find out that the show was actually pre-recorded. At the station, the police officer who took a note from Professor receives a message from masked vigilante number 1, asking for help. Hyun visits teacher in his cell and gives him an alarm watch for emergencies since he is officially a target. Detective is studying Kim's and his grandmother's files when he learns that Kim is adopted. He figures that Kim is the tech-savvy person Dan was talking about and informs Hyun about it. Kim and his grandmother have a heartfelt conversation where she tells him that she is going to turn herself in for him and he should go to Germany to study, which makes him very emotional and tearful. Outside their house, Hyun and Detective Choi talk about the new development. He steps outside the car and leaks to politician about Kim's involvement. Meanwhile, teacher asks for his medicine, and the officer contacted by masked vigilante hands him a medicine cup. Suddenly, he's not able to breathe after drinking from the cup, and he's rushed to the hospital. Politician also rushes to the hospital and is informed teacher ingested nicotine, which is too much for his weak heart. Coincidentally, fiancé is in the same hospital recovering from his gunshot wound. He discreetly kidnaps the stable but unconscious teacher and leaves the hospital in an ambulance. By the time politician enters the room, the bed is empty. Meanwhile, detective arrests Kim's grandmother in a supermarket. Teacher wakes up to find himself being streamed live, facing the professor. Professor tells him if he sincerely apologizes, the people may take pity on him and vote no, but he's arrogant and unapologetic. Professor asks why he killed his daughter, and he answers because professor paid him no attention because of her. Fiancé smashes teacher's watch so that the police can't track him anymore. The police lose their lead, but they've already triangulated a general area, and detective tells them to look out for power surges. Professor plays loud music, which is torture to teacher's weak heart. Teacher looks at the camera and hurls insults at the people. Undoubtedly, this just makes more people vote yes. Dan finds a power surge in a nearby internet cafe, and Hyun enters without waiting for backup. She searches the cafe and finds a hidden door. While outside, she asks the masked vigilante who is inside to come out, promising not to hurt him. Sure enough, it turns out to be Kim. Voting ends with a verdict to execute. Teacher finally collapses from the loud noise just as the police arrive, so Professor moves to choke him to death. The police restrain him while Detective tries to revive Teacher. Professor begs Detective not to save him, and Detective hesitates, remembering the voice of Professor's daughter in the video. Detective saves Teacher anyway, upsetting Professor. In a flashback 8 years ago, we realize Detective Choi took a bribe from politician to protect Teacher. At present, Professor and fiancé are arrested. Detective Choi insists on taking Teacher to the hospital and leaves first, with fiancé as well, in the first car. Prison guard also insists on accompanying Professor to prison, together with Detective, in the second car. Meanwhile, Hyun escorts Kim outside the building, but a group of youngsters organized by Hyun's sister suddenly crowd around her, which allows Kim to escape with Hyun's sister. Detective Choi informs politician that he's taking Teacher to the hospital. She spots 2 police cars and asks him which car they're riding in. Detective Choi ponders and lies there in the second car. When the cars cross an intersection, a truck rams into the first car, which is Detective Choi's car. Fiancé dies on impact. Detective rushes and pulls Detective Choi out of the car, which is about to explode. Prison guard releases Professor, who immediately goes to the other car to finish Teacher. Teacher taunts Professor with details about his daughter's death, and Professor approaches him with a piece of broken glass. Detective stops him but gets stabbed by prison guard. This allows Professor to finally stab Teacher. The car catches fire and explodes, with a smiling Teacher inside. Professor and prison guard get into the other car and escape. Dan calls Hyun to inform her of everything, which stops her pursuit of Kim. Politician arrives at the scene after the paramedics and is distraught to learn of her son's death. While talking with his senior, Detective wonders if politician is behind the attack since she found them so quickly. The senior questions Detective Choi's loyalty, but Detective trusts him. Hyun's sister helps Kim settle down in an apartment, and he opens up about Teacher unaliving his sister. By now, the team has figured prison guard is the missing masked vigilante. Back at work, Hyun shows Detective a recording of Detective Choi's phone call with politician, revealing their partnership. Turns out Detective had already figured it out when Teacher turned himself in, because only the 3 of them knew of the video Hyun found. Hyun then plays the part where politician asks Detective Choi which car her son is in. Detective hears Detective Choi lie and realizes he saved his life. They also figure Detective Choi must have saved these call recordings on purpose to implicate politician. Detective pays a visit to politician, who's mourning her son. She blames the police for Teacher's death, but Detective reminds her that she is the one who killed him. Politician sues the police, but they know it's just her tactic of buying time to cover the fact she's the one who hired the track driver. Hyun notices her sister's suspicious movements, and she devises a plan with Detective. Hyun texts her sister that Kim is on the wanted list. Her sister panics and rushes to the apartment, unknowingly leading Hyun and Detective. They arrive to an empty apartment, and Hyun reprimands her sister for being willful, then forcefully takes Kim's new number. Kim is actually at the seaside with Professor and prison guard, who is masked vigilante number 3. Professor implores Kim to leave, and prison guard hands him a fake ID and flight tickets. Before leaving, Kim asks Professor if he resents him for being late to meet his daughter on the day she died, and Professor says no. By going through prison guard's properties, the team finds Professor's potential hiding place. Meanwhile, journalist gets kidnapped by politician. Just then, she receives a call from Detective, and she leaves clues about her predicament. Kim secretly visits Hyun's sister, where he informs her that he'll be leaving while his father will expose teachers' and politicians' crimes then turn himself in. Just then the killing vote begins again, and the target is Professor, putting himself on the vote for all his killings. Kim frantically tries to contact Professor to stop him. In the meantime, Hyun's sister secretly informs Hyun of their location. Kim wants to leave to stop Professor, but Hyun's sister stops him. He persuades her to let him go and promises to turn himself in after he stops Professor from killing himself. She agrees but accompanies him and texts Hyun that Kim will turn himself in after he finishes what he wants to do. The police arrive at Professor's hideout, and Detective proceeds alone to negotiate. At the same time, Kim starts a live stream. He removes his mask and tells everyone what Teacher did to Professor, then implores them to vote no. Politician, who is monitoring online forums, also sees his identity and, driven by vengeance, puts a bounty on his head. Hyun and Dan realize Kim is now in danger and rush to his location. A group of bullies from Kim's school see the bounty on Kim's head and start looking for him. At the same time, the public, after listening to Kim's story of injustice, abstain from voting, and the killing vote is cancelled. Kim receives a call from his grandmother, asking him to turn himself in since Hyun promised to protect him, and Detective is on his way to save Professor. Kim agrees, but unfortunately, the group of bullies show up. Detective enters the hideout right after Professor hangs himself and holds him up, calling for help. Meanwhile, prison guard gets into a car and escapes. Elsewhere, Hyun and Dan keep searching for Kim and her sister. The police badge into politician's house to rescue journalist after seeing her kidnapping footage, but they find her safely having tea with politician. Journalist pretends everything is fine and leaves. At this time, Kim is getting beat up by the group of bullies. One of them starts hitting him with a metal pipe just as Hyun and Dan arrive, her gun drawn. Regardless, the boy hits Kim behind the head. As they rush to him, the boys run away. While Kim is bleeding out, he gives Hyun a flash drive. Professor is revived at the hideout, but in Hyun's arms, Kim is unresponsive. Prison guard sees from a security camera that Professor survived, and he angrily turns back. Hyun arrives at the hideout and hits Professor, telling him it's his fault. Professor is in denial, but the truth soon sets in that now he's lost both his kids, and he sinks to his knees in despair. On the way to the police station, Professor requests Detective to stop by the seashore to say goodbye to his daughter, and Detective agrees. Professor and Detective are talking when they're suddenly interrupted by prison guard, holding Hyun at gunpoint. Prison guard asks Detective to let Professor go, and he will free Hyun, so Detective drops his gun and moves away. Professor offers prison guard the program's flash drive so that he can change the world however he sees fit. This delights but also distracts prison guard, offering Hyun the chance to push the gun off his hand. Prison guard rushes to grab the flash drive, and in the chaos, they both fall into the water, and Detective jumps in after them. Sometime later, the police chief holds a press conference and declares Professor, Kim and prison guard dead, closing the case. He also lies that Professor killed Kim, angering Hyun. Detective is saddened by their deaths, and as he's going through the case files, he notices something and rushes to politician's house with his team. At the scene of the death of Professor's daughter, his team is breaking down the pillar when politician arrives in a panic, questioning their motives. He tells her a search warrant was issued. She takes out her phone to call a lawyer, but he tells her nobody in the country could help her as the commissioner is unreachable and her husband is divorcing her, leaving her dumbfounded. The team breaks the column in the room to find another column hidden inside it. They use UV light, revealing bloodstains. In a flashback, we see politician was watching from the balcony as teacher and retard carried the body of Professor's daughter. She went to the basement and saw blood all over the column. At present, Detective arrests politician now that there's finally enough evidence. Hyun stands by the seashore and throws the flash drive Kim gave her into the sea. Detective says that's the passcode to the killing vote and asks her if she's sure, and she affirms. Hyun also tells him that he still doesn't understand what Professor really wanted. So, she denies his offer to join his team and decides to go back to her previous department. 1 year later, Hyun is the ace of her team, Detective Choi has quit and is working in a cafe, and Dan is dating one of the female police on the team. Meanwhile, it is the 20th birthday of Hyun's sister, and she receives a pre-programmed message from Kim. He admits she was a bright spot in his life, then apologizes and thanks her for everything. Hyun still keeps track of people who are found at sea, just in case Professor is still alive since they never recovered his body. Detective meets Detective Choi, and they discuss how politician was let go after her secretary took the fall for her. But Detective Choi still believes in Detective's ability to change things. Meanwhile, politician is helping at a volunteer event, seemingly repentant of her crimes. However, after the event, she gets into a car with someone suspicious. We learn they're working on a new Killing V0te program, with their first target being the politician who organized the volunteer event. Detective is tracking taxi driver when a biker pulls up and hands him a Killing V0te flash drive. Detective catches up to taxi driver and beats him up for helping criminals. Around the same time, Hyun receives an email from someone named Watchdog 6, about an update involving an unidentified man. The drama ends with Detective putting on a dog mask as he walks into the street, and a hand underwater grabbing a Killing V0te flash drive. Subscribe, like, comment, and share for more content like this. Bye.